Good evening. My name is Bill Martin, and I direct the Religion and Public Policy program here at the Baker Institute. We're expecting a few people to keep on coming in today, but since Dr. Chancey has to get back to the airport not long after his scheduled time to here, we're not going to hold the start any longer. And it's also a good thing to start on time, I think. In 2005, I got an email from Professor David Newman, who was teaching at the time at Odessa College. And he was also a Rice alum. He had not been one of my students, and for which he apologized appropriately. But he was aware of what I studied, and he told me that and in the Ector County, Odessa Independent School District, an organization called the National Council on Bible Curriculum in the Public Schools was preparing to offer a Bible course in the schools. He wanted to try to find out about that, and found out that they would not share the curriculum with anybody who wasn't pretty much committed to believing it was a desirable thing to do what they were doing. He was able to discover by looking on the website, it was not only distinctly Christian, but essentially fundamentalist, and strongly influenced by people who were associated with Pat Robertson's Regent University and some other highly ideological organizations. David is Jewish, and he feared that his daughter would be subjected to harassment, as she already had been just for being Jewish, but that in this particular program, as it looked like it was going to be, that might that would even be greater, and he was worried about that. I was able, through his good offices, finally, he was able to get a copy, and he sent me a copy to look at. To put it kindly, it was a mess. It was a pastiche of low quality. About 1/3 of it was plagiarized, some of it from a Bible commentary published in 1832. It clearly had a fundamentalist perspective not shared by mainline Protestants, Roman Catholics, or Jews, or virtually anyone in mainstream biblical scholarship, and certainly not by believers in non-Christian religions or in no religion at all. David Newman had contacted me because he was aware of my work on fundamentalisms and also the Christian right. He also contacted Professor Mark Chancey, a biblical scholar at SMU, and our speaker tonight. As you can tell from the program, Dr. Chancey's scholarly specialty had been and continues to be the archaeology of Galilee. But David Newman's letter piqued his interest. And for the record, both Dr. Chancey and I believe that it is appropriate for students in public schools to receive instruction regarding the content of the Bible. Knowledge of how it's produced, the different collections that are favored by Jews, Roman Catholics, and Protestants, its value as literature, its influence in history, and so forth. That was not the approach of this curriculum. Dr. Chancey learned, or perhaps already knew, that the Texas Freedom Network, an organization dedicated to preserving the vital separation of church and state, was also interested in this issue. And he wrote to Ryan Valentine, the deputy director of the Texas Freedom Network and the director of the Texas Faith Network, who is a guest of ours here tonight, and asked what he could do to help. My guess is that he had no idea how helpful he was going to prove to be, or that, at least for a time, his focus was going to shift from the shores of Galilee to the dusts of Odessa. Such things happen. One day in 1985, I got a letter from Billy Graham that dramatically altered the course of my life for 5 years and continues to affect it a quarter century later. But within a month, Dr. Chancey, or within a few months, he produced a thorough examination of the curriculum proposed for the Odessa schools. And as a result, that curriculum was substantially revised, but in a second larger study that included other other Bible curricula that were being proposed or used, Dr. Chancey demonstrated that it continued to have many, many problems. For his troubles, he and the Texas Freedom Network were denounced as far-left religious extremists who were promoting totalitarianism and trying to ban the Bible from the public schools, even though his report was endorsed by 180 biblical scholars at colleges, universities, divinity schools, and seminaries. To the best of my knowledge, I don't think anyone questioned whether he was born in the United States. As a result of his developing that expertise, Dr. Chancey is regarded as and perhaps the leading authority on a variety of efforts to introduce theologically biased instruction into the nation's public schools. This is a much more important enterprise and intensive effort than many people recognize. At present, there's a quite active effort led by David Barton, another Texan whose Wall Builders organization is is dedicated to the proposition that the Founding Fathers explicitly intended to establish a Christian nation and that Christianity should have a place of official privilege in the nation's governance and its culture, including its schools. This viewpoint has been openly affirmed by recent editions of the Texas State Board of Education, quite notably in the 2010 deliberations over the content of social science textbooks. It's important that we know and think seriously about these matters, and that's why we are fortunate to have Dr. Chancey to speak with us this evening. Will you join me in welcoming him?
Well, thank you so much for that very kind and gracious introduction, and for the invitation to join you. It's good to be here with you tonight. Thank you for coming to listen to discussion of these topics tonight. I think it's safe to say that when I got into this issue, I had no idea exactly what it was that I was getting into. And it certainly had a bigger impact on my life and my career than I had expected. I've learned, for example, that when I write about ancient Galilee, no one talks back at me. And I think I prefer that. I don't get angry emails about the people that I talked about. And I've certainly gotten my fair share of those with this research. Some very, very upset people. No one has threatened to kill me, but several have told me where I'm going when I die. So it's a different universe. I was so sheltered when I limited myself to Roman period archaeology. It was a simpler day and time, but it's gone forever. Because this is an important issue. It's one that completely fascinates me. It is a passion. It is important. It has to do with our public education system. It has to do with our citizenry. It has to do with citizenship. I'm so grateful that you've joined me tonight to talk about it. I'm going to consider political, policy, and cultural aspects of recent controversies concerning religion and public education in Texas schools. And the controversies I'll explore all revolve around the treatment of religion in the curriculum. Now, as Dr. Martin said, I believe that there are sound reasons to talk about religion in public schools. People across the political and religious spectrums have argued that religious literacy is a fundamental component of a broader cultural literacy. Many have also rightly emphasized the civic benefits of religious literacy. Our nation's citizenry is growing more diverse. Our world is growing smaller. Globalization is bringing us closer to other societies. And religious literacy is essential for the smooth functioning of a pluralistic democracy in a shrinking world. And yet, the question remains of how to teach about religion and what to teach. As with every aspect of public education, these issues are highly politicized, and we've witnessed this politicization here in Texas in a state law mandating instruction about the Bible, in the creation of social studies standards that emphasize religion while downplaying separation of church and state, and in the State Board of Education's approval of a resolution condemning purported pro-Islamic bias in textbooks. These measures vividly illustrate the maxim that classrooms are often the very front lines of the culture wars. What are we to make of this? To what extent are such initiatives driven merely by the commitment to religious literacy? To what extent are they driven by a desire to promote certain religious viewpoints over others? And what are their broader implications? These are the sorts of questions I'll explore tonight. Scholars have long noted that debates over public education reflect larger struggles over the definition of American identity. And that is definitely the case here. The Texas controversies are controversies about what it means to be a real American. A real American. For some of the elected officials driving these measures, real Americans, and of course I use that in quote, real Americans are predominantly theologically and socially conservative Protestants who subscribe to what I call a Christian America ideology. People with this ideology believe that the Founding Fathers established America to be a distinctively Christian nation. And by Christian, they mean roughly equivalent in theology and politics to the contemporary Christian right. The Founding Fathers, in this view, were largely theologically orthodox Christians, and the Bible was the direct inspiration for our nation's foundational documents. Unfortunately, the logic goes, unfortunately, the nation has drifted from its roots. It has forsaken its heritage. Christian Americanists are thus a restorationist movement who hope to move America back to an idealized past in which government foregrounded conservative Protestant concerns. Real Americans, in this view, adhere to this ideology. As former State Board of Education Chairman Don McElroy told a Tea Party conference in St. Louis last month, "For a free society, history is everything. But the greatest problem facing America today," he said, "is that we have forgotten what it means to be an American." Mainstream America, McElroy urged, wants their children to know what it means to be an American. For McElroy, what it means to be an American is to be a Christian, and more specifically, to be a Christian like him. So throughout this lecture, I'll use the terms Christian America, Christian Americanists, to refer to this religious and political ideology. I am not making broader claims about the many conservative Protestants and other Christians who do not hold this view. I'm referring to a very particular ideology and its adherents. So please hear my focus there. This is the context within which we should understand the promotion of Bible courses in Texas. There are sensible reasons from a cultural literacy perspective for studying the Bible, but that's not the only thing going on in this movement. The emphasis on Bible courses is driven at least partly by Christian America ideology. Many people are surprised to learn that Bible courses are legal at all. A 1963 Supreme Court decision prohibited school-sponsored devotional Bible reading in public schools, but it explicitly affirmed the educational value of studying the Bible and comparative religions from an objective and secular perspective. Various federal courts have decided that to be constitutional, a public Bible course must neither promote nor disparage any particular religious viewpoint. It must neither promote nor disparage religion in general. It must neither promote nor disparage non-religion in general. Does this sound easy or straightforward to you? Bible courses have been in Texas since the early 20th century. They've never gone away. But in 2007, the state passed a law requiring public schools to teach students something about the Bible somewhere in the curriculum. And the law encouraged schools to meet this requirement by offering elective Bible courses. The original form of the bill required every school district in Texas to offer a Bible course and prohibited the state from developing any standards or approving any particular curriculum. It required districts to teach a course for which it provided no guidance at all. How did the bill's sponsor justify this? It was Representative Warren Chisholm. Representative Chisholm appealed to cultural literacy. He explained, there's a lot of stuff in our Bible that finds its way into our dictionaries, into our art, into all of our literature, and into our laws. He's exactly right on that count. And yet, if the goal was to promote religious literacy, why did he introduce a Bible bill and not a bill promoting the study of the so-called world religions? Why the focus? For Chisholm and his allies, cultural literacy was not the only motivation. Chisholm also emphasized the importance of the Bible in the worldviews of the Founding Fathers, who, he claimed, regarded it as the ultimate source for morality. Chisholm argued that it was important for students to read the Bible so that they could be moral people like the Founding Fathers. We need for people to know why we are the sort of country we are, Chisholm said. We ought to know where we come from and why we do what we do. Now, ultimately, the House Education Committee amended Chisholm's bill, and the law as passed does require every school district to teach about the Bible, but somewhere in the curriculum. It doesn't really give much guidance where or how, and it does not require Bible courses per se. It still, however, encourages districts to offer those courses, and a fair number do. Texas is not the only state with a Bible law. Georgia, Tennessee, Oklahoma, they've all passed Bible course laws. Bills are currently pending in Kentucky and in Arkansas. Alabama and Missouri have seen Bible bills in the past. And if you investigate the rationales behind these bills, you find that religious literacy is always cited, but it is never the only reason. Consider the comments of the sponsor of the Georgia bill, a state senator. This country, he said, is built on the Judeo-Christian faith, ethics, knowledge of the Scriptures. Our founding fathers were often quoting the Scriptures. Consider this statement from the author of the Oklahoma law. This bill allows schools to represent our American heritage from a Christian biblical perspective without fear of retribution. And I think they should be able to do so. It wasn't Hinduism or Buddhism that motivated them to move to these shores. It was Christianity and the desire to worship freely. Another Oklahoma legislator echoes these sentiments. Our nation, he says, was founded on Christian principles, and if we don't teach them to our children now, in a few generations, America's values will be lost in history. He emphasized, of course, at the same time, we don't want this to be an in-your-face sort of thing about Christianity. Now, state law or not, Bible courses are already taught across the Union. What actually happens in them? Well, as Dr. Martin mentioned, Texas Freedom Network, an Austin-based watchdog group that sees itself as a counterweight to the religious right, asked me to study Texas Bible courses taught in 2005-2006. So this was before the Texas Bible law. And our findings were very, very clear. Most Bible courses promote certain religious beliefs over others. They promote Christianity, and in particular, they promote theological views that are primarily or even exclusively held among certain conservative Protestants. In different courses, students are taught that the Bible is the inspired Word of God in public schools, that the Bible is accurate in every historical and scientific detail, that the miracles happened just as reported in the Bible, that Judaism is a failed religion that was replaced by Christianity, that dinosaurs and humans once roamed the earth together before Noah's flood, and my personal favorite, that NASA has found a missing day in time that confirms the biblical story of the sun standing still. When I read that, I did what any reasonable person would do. I called NASA. And it turned out that the missing day and time was missing. I was looking for some statement somewhere, and in fact, I found a web page on a NASA website saying, no, of course this is an urban legend. But you have urban legends being presented as mainstream science and biblical scholarship in Texas public schools today. Some districts use the Christian Americanist curriculum that Dr. Martin was discussing beforehand, and this curriculum teaches that the Bible is the basis for the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. In some of these courses, the promotion of religious beliefs appears to be intentional. But in many cases, it seems to happen despite the very best intentions of very good teachers, simply because they don't have the state and local resources and support they need to teach the course appropriately. In light of that, it's unfortunate that even after the Bible law was passed, the State Board of Education very pointedly declined to develop content-specific standards for Bible courses. They have sent teachers into a minefield without a map. Texas teachers do have a map on how to teach social studies, however, especially after last year's bruising fight, and that's the topic to which I'll now turn. So much has been said about the social studies TEKS. TEKS is the acronym for Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills. The TEKS have been accused of leaning right politically, of whitewashing history by overlooking the contributions of diverse ethnic groups, of being little more than isolated facts strung together like popcorn on a string. One historian calls them an overstuffed laundry list that treats seniors like kindergartners. Another calls them a culturally irrelevant history of melodramatic minutia. Even the right-leaning Thomas B. Fordham Foundation faults the Texas standards for being, quote, selective, fragmentary, and historically vapid checklists that avoid clear historical explanation while offering misrepresentations at every turn. Understanding the TEKS process is important, but because that process is cumbersome, I'll give you a very streamlined summary. When a subject comes up for review, the State Board of Education appoints a few expert reviewers who look at the old standards and suggest revisions. Several review committees, made up primarily of educators and academics, though not exclusively, consider the recommendations of the expert reviewers and amend the old TEKS, effectively creating new ones, and the board members then consider changes along the way. There are opportunities for public comment, and at the end of the process, the Board of Education edits the standards, adding, subtracting, changing content as it sees fit. So the real power in this process is in the State Board of Education, and these are elected officials who are not content specialists, educators, or scholars, and yet they determine the content for every subject in Texas. The ideological dimensions of the social studies revision process were evident from the very beginning when the expert reviewers were appointed. There were 6 experts, 3 of them academics from Texas colleges and universities, and these Texas scholars made their own important contributions, but not so much in the area of religion, so I'm not going to talk about them very much. I'm going to talk about the other 3 expert reviewers. The 4th was Daniel Dreisbach, a professor in the School of Public Affairs at American University. Dreisbach is well known for his position that the Founding Fathers, on the whole, did not intend the First Amendment to create a wall of separation between church and state. In the view of Dreisbach, religion has been driven from the public square in ways that the Founding Fathers never anticipated. The other 2 expert reviewers were not scholars. One was David Barton, who's already been mentioned today. David Barton is the founder of Wall Builders. This is a company based in Aledo, Texas, that ironically, despite its name, Wall Builders, is devoted to tearing down the wall separating church and state. Barton is a political activist who is very visible in the state Republican Party, also in national Republican circles, and it is under his influence, to a considerable degree, that the state Republican Party for years has had a plank in its platform denouncing the myth of separation of church and state. Barton is also a key figure in the Bible in Schools movement. As I mentioned, there are Bible course materials that explicitly promote his Christian American ideology. Some Texas courses watch David Barton's video, Foundations of American Government, even before they read Genesis. This video argues that the Founding Fathers intended to found a Christian nation and that increases in sexually transmitted diseases, teen pregnancies, divorces, and violent crimes can be attributed to the Supreme Court's prohibition of school prayer and Bible reading. This is being shown in Texas public schools. Barton also writes books, articles, pamphlets, blogs. He has a radio show, and he leads spiritual heritage tours in Washington, D.C. Expert reviewer number 6 was Peter Marshall of Peter Marshall Ministries. According to the ministry's website, it is dedicated to helping to restore America to the Bible-based foundations through preaching, teaching, and writing on America's Christian heritage and on Christian discipleship and revival. Marshall, who died last fall, was a popular writer and speaker, and his books on what he regards as America's Christian heritage have been staples for homeschoolers for decades. These 3 expert reviewers argued for a heavy injection of religion into the TEKS. They suggested that to be historically accurate, Texas's schools should emphasize America's Christian heritage. And their reports gave like-minded State Board of Education members all of the support they needed to make changes. Some of the changes to the TEKS were subtle, others were anything but subtle. Some appear unremarkable until you study the documents behind them and see the rationale. To understand the role of religion in the new TEKS, we should start at the beginning of American history. You can see this Christian Americanist agenda at play in the way the TEKS treat the American colonial period. For example, when students study the reasons for the establishment of the colonies, they'll learn that one factor was religious intolerance in Europe. That's the quote. Now, it's one of our most cherished national myths that colonists fled the intolerance of Europe to experience religious freedom in the New World. And like all myths, there's considerable truth here, but there is also oversimplification. Some groups fled intolerance. Some groups sought religious freedom in the colonies, but they sought freedom for themselves and not for other groups toward whom they continued to show intolerance. Jews, Catholics, Quakers, Baptists, other dissenters were groups of legalized persecution and discrimination. So the broad freedom that we think of when we say the words religious freedom, that freedom was slow in coming, but students won't learn that in Texas social studies classes. Christian Americanists like to point out the religiosity of the early colonists, and they very accurately note the explicitly Christian content of many of the colonial governing documents from the 1500s, the 1600s, and the early 1700s. Where they misstep is when they draw a straight line from these early colonial documents that came out of particular communities and colonies, all the way over to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, placing all of these documents on an even setting in a trajectory that points straight towards an explicitly Christian government. It is important to know about the early colonial documents. It is important to know about their religious dimensions, but it is also important to know how those texts differ from the ones that actually bind us together as a national body, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Noting those differences is not the goal of the TEKS. They highlight the Christian elements. So, of course, students will learn about the Mayflower Compact, the governing document of the Plymouth Colony, but the reasons for studying it go beyond its importance as one of our earliest colonial governing documents. The Mayflower Compact notes religion as a motivation for the colony. It was done, quote, for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith and the honor of our king and country. Some board members regarded the Mayflower Compact not only as the governing document for the Plymouth Colony, but also as the foundational document for the entire United States of America. Thus, former Board of Education member Cynthia Dunbar writes, "This is undeniably our past, and it clearly delineates us as a nation intended to be emphatically Christian." Other documents are a little more obscure for most people, though not perhaps to political theorists and American historians. Students will learn about the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut of 1639 and the role that the Reverend Thomas Hooker played in that document's creation. Expert reviewer David Barton explains, "The importance of a written constitution cannot be understood unless one understands why written documents were originally introduced into the American government." Barton goes on, "In 1638, when the Reverend Hooker established Connecticut, Hooker delivered a famous sermon based on Deuteronomy and Exodus that argued that the governed appoint their officials, the governed determine the limits of power of officials. For Barton, this demonstrates that the Bible is the direct inspiration for the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, and the Bible is the direct inspiration for the idea that citizens appoint their leaders, which is a fundamental premise of our way of government. And that is why the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut and Thomas Hooker are both fundamental knowledge for Texas high school students." Hooker is not the only colonial figure added to the Teaks. There are many others from the early periods, as well as the Revolutionary War era and immediately afterwards. And many of these are the standard names you would expect: Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison. The expert reviewers and the dominant board members often seem to have made religion the primary criterion when determining which other names to add. They made a point of adding individuals they believed to have been theologically orthodox Christians, who at one point in their lives said or were believed to have said something about the importance of religion for sound government and healthy society. So the Teaks have multiple vague references to the motivations of the Founding Fathers. And when they refer to motivations, they're talking about these explicitly religious motivations. So if you were a Founding Father and you at any point said something nice about Christianity, it's entirely likely that Texas students will now learn your name. John Adams once said that religion and morality were the only foundation for government. So he's there. Now there will be other reasons for having him there, but that's a main reason why he's in the Texas Teaks. Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, Benjamin Rush, Charles Pinckney, Roger Sherman, John Witherspoon, John Peter Muhlenberg, they are all there. Again, there will be good reasons to note them, but the primary reason they're there is because board members and key expert reviewers regarded their religiosity as evidence of America's distinctive Christian identity. The numerous other colonial figures who perhaps did not provide such explicit support for that agenda are extremely less likely to be mentioned in the Teaks. Consider John Wise, who is mentioned. John Wise was a Congregationalist minister in Massachusetts in the late 1600s and the early 1700s. He protested British taxation. That would probably be enough to get him mentioned. According to expert reviewer David Barton, Wise penned 2 works forcefully asserting that democracy was God's ordained government in both church and state, thus causing historians to title Wise the founder of American democracy. In this construal, Wise shows us that democracy is God's will, and his writings show us that the whole American system of government is divinely ordained. Other founders are included in the Teaks because they were strongly influenced by the Reformed theological tradition, which emphasizes the total depravity of man. For these particular founding fathers, humanity's total depravity was why government needed to have checks and balances, limited terms, separation of powers, boundaries for the government. Some board members and their expert reviewers regard this Reformed influence as evidence that key constitutional concepts are inspired directly by the Bible. students will learn those founders' names who made such claims. They will not learn the names of founders who argued for such things on different terms. In light of this, it's probably not surprising that in a world history course, John Calvin's name has been added alongside Thomas Jefferson in a standard emphasizing how contemporary political systems have developed from earlier systems of government. And this idea that our foundational documents are directly inspired from Christian scripture is argued at length in the writings of David Barton, Peter Marshall, and board members like Cynthia Dunbar. Students will also learn about the influence of 18th century English jurist William Blackstone and his influence, quote, on the development of self-government in colonial America. Why Blackstone? Blackstone wrote an extraordinarily influential commentary on English common law, and colonial lawyers studied his works, though they indisputably had an impact on American political thought. The three conservative expert reviewers all insisted on including Blackstone in the Teaks. And I couldn't figure out why, because they never fully explained it, other than, oh, his commentaries were influential. It wasn't until I went back and looked at David Barton's other books and at the book that board member Cynthia Dunbar wrote that I figured it out. It's easy to sum up why students are learning about Blackstone. Blackstone regarded the laws of man, his words, the laws of man as subordinate to the laws of nature and of nature's God. Thomas Jefferson incorporates this very phrase, the laws of nature and of nature's God, into the opening sentence of the Declaration of Independence. Thus, by implication, both Blackstone and Jefferson believed that God's laws were supreme. This idea is in our Declaration of Independence. Barton and Dunbar then go further and argue the God in question is indisputably the God of the Christian Bible. They have thus imported the Christian God fully into the Declaration of Independence, and this is why students will learn Blackstone's name. Former board chair Don McElroy illustrates a similar argument. Referring to the Declaration's opening lines, he told the Tea Party Conference, on July 4th, 1776, Thomas Jefferson charted the course for a new nation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. According to McElroy, it's here in the Declaration of Independence that we can clearly establish that our nation was founded on biblical principles. How do people with this view of a biblically inspired America reconcile that view with the religion clauses of the First Amendment? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, the Establishment Clause, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, the Free Exercise Clause. For key board members, the original intention of the First Amendment was simply and solely to prohibit the establishment of a national state church. The notion that the First Amendment establishes some sort of separation between church and state, in their view, is a drastic misinterpretation. So what will Texan schools teach? For the high school United States government course, the board added this standard. Examine the reasons the Founding Fathers protected religious freedom in America and guaranteed its free exercise in the First Amendment, and compare and contrast this to the phrase separation of church and state. So students won't learn about separation of church and state as a summary of the meaning of the religion clauses, or even as one of several important interpretations of the religion clauses. They will compare and contrast the idea of church-state separation with the First Amendment. The board members who supported this compare and contrast approach have said explicitly they were trying to expose students to the fallacy of church-state separation. According to board member Ken Mercer, I think their point, the Founding Fathers, was that they did not want a separation from religion. They just wanted to avoid having a national denomination, one religion that everyone would have to follow. McElroy told the Tea Partiers that the board added the phrase separation of church and state to the Teaks so that our children will know that it is not in the Constitution. What we have in America in the Constitution, McElroy reasoned, is not the separation of church and state. What we have is the disestablishment of religion. David Bradley, another Board of Education member, put it even more bluntly. I reject the notion by the left of a constitutional separation of church and state. I have $1,000 for the charity of your choice, if you can find it in the Constitution. He has not given that money out. That was a joke. He's right on this point. You know, the words separation of church and state aren't in the Constitution, but neither are the terms federalism, separation of powers, and checks and balances. These are terms that the TEECs repeatedly refer to as constitutional. What matters is if an idea is in the Constitution, not the exact term. No one can dispute that the establishment of a national state church and prohibiting it was one of the rationales for the First Amendment. Of course it was. And you can certainly point to founding fathers for whom that was the primary rationale. They did not want an established state church. But there were certainly other founders who had a broader view of religious freedom, most notably the Virginians James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, of course, is the one who made famous the phrase, the wall of separation between church and state. When it comes to the nature of religious freedom, the founding fathers had differences of opinion. They said different things at different times. When Christian Americanists look back at this history, they quote only their friends, and then often out of context. They ignore other voices. How can we define original intent when the reality is that the original intentions of the founders were quite diverse? Church-state separationists are quick to point out that if the founders had wanted the First Amendment's Establishment Clause to be narrowly limited only to disestablishment of a national state church, they could have made that point easily and explicitly, and they did not. They considered wording that would have made that point, and they rejected it. They ended up with a broad and vague phrase, the prohibition of the establishment of religion. Some founding fathers were happy with this wording. Some founding fathers were less happy with this wording, but this is the wording they chose. The problem with the Texas Standard, compare and contrast, at least as its advocates intended, is not that it requires critical assessment of the meaning of the First Amendment. The problem is that it shuts off debate by excluding the fact that separation of church and state has been an important interpretation of that amendment from the beginning, as seen in the writings of Jefferson. Thus, the title of my lecture, Educating for a Christian America. That's the vision of a significant block of elected officials, including both legislators and Board of Education members. For Texas, where will non-Christians fit into the discussion of religion in public schools? They certainly won't learn much about non-Christians in American history. As for world history, time doesn't permit us to explore those TEECs in detail, but I would like to examine briefly a subject that will surely be a flashpoint of controversy: Islam. The TEECs treat Islam as a monolithic religion, undifferentiated by sect, theology, or geographical location, much less by variables such as gender and class. Nowhere in the TEECs can you find the words Shiite or Sunni. 10 years and 2 wars after September 11th, and we're still not teaching even the basics. Students will learn how Islam influences law and government in the Muslim world, a clear indication of anxiety about Sharia, but with no acknowledgement of differences within the Islamic world and no comparable attention to how other religious traditions affect law and government. Students will learn about Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism, and they will learn, quote, how Arab rejection of the State of Israel has led to ongoing conflict. After all, as McElroy once said, the way I evaluate history book textbooks is first I see how they cover Israel. This past fall, the State Board passed a resolution condemning what it called a pro-Islamic, anti-Christian bias in past social studies textbooks. It said that pro-Islamic, anti-Christian, half-truth, selective disinformation, and false editorial stereotypes roil social studies textbooks nationwide. The resolution was accompanied by an appendix that attempted to document pro-Islamic, anti-Christian bias in the textbooks. Having examined some of the textbooks in question, and these are 1999 editions that don't even circulate in Texas anymore, the document was completely inaccurate, and it relied on anti-Islamic sources. What was the motivation for this resolution? The author was afraid of Muslim conspiracies, global Muslim conspiracies, to infiltrate the textbook market in an effort to, quote, take over the minds of our young people and then take over the nation. For the board members who supported this resolution, as non-Christians, Muslims are the other. This is the same anxiety we see reflected in the dozen or so Sharia bills currently in state legislatures. As non-Christians, American Muslims apparently don't deserve the same respect as other citizens. You certainly did not hear the supporters of the resolution expressing concern for the hundreds of thousands of Muslims living in Texas. I'd like to conclude with just a few reflections on the significance of all of this. First of all, as has often been noted, Texas has a significant impact on the textbook market because of its size. What happens in Texas doesn't stay in Texas. What publishers put into their textbooks to meet the Texas standards will find their way into other textbooks of other states. Second, it might not surprise you to learn that I think our curriculum process in Texas is broken. I'm no educational policy expert, but I do know that a system that allows people who are neither educators nor content specialists nor scholars to have this much control over the content of our curriculum is deeply flawed. Standards-based education is particularly vulnerable to being co-opted. Third, I'd like to emphasize that this idea of a Christian America already goes far beyond Texas. Americans are genuinely confused about the role religion played in America's foundation. A 2007 survey by the First Amendment Center found that 65% of those polled agreed that the nation's founders intended the United States to be a Christian nation. 55% thought that the Constitution establishes a Christian nation. Fourth, as a society, we're confused and conflicted about the proper relationship between church and state. This goes back to the Founding Fathers. The new social studies standards will not help us sort through this tangle of issues. Teaching our students misinformation will make it harder in the future for citizens to engage in the thoughtful deliberation required to find compromises between people with different views. These sorts of issues will take on greater and greater significance and urgency as our nation's population becomes more religiously diverse. And to some extent, Christian Americanist ideology is driven by anxiety over pluralism. In conclusion, religious literacy is a laudable goal that serves a legitimate civic purpose, but controversies like these illustrate the extent to which the rhetoric of cultural literacy can mask another agenda, the promotion of one set of religious beliefs above all others. The importance of religion in American history is well worth studying, but not in ways that misrepresent that history for the purpose of elevating one contemporary religious voice above everyone else. And so the public school is once again at the front lines of the struggle to define American identity. As the late Peter Marshall observed, we're in an all-out moral and spiritual civil war for the soul of America, and the record of American history is right at the heart of it. For once, he got it right. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dr. Chancey. I'm sure you will, before you have a chance to get out into the warm February air, that some of you will have questions you would like to ask. And as I say, we do have to go in a little bit, but we can take some questions.
What do you see as the way out of our schools teaching fantasy ideologies?
Well, we have to change who's developing the content that they are, and that means revamping the process at the state. The question was, how do we change the system so that students aren't learning fantasy ideologies? And the answer is that the system has to be fixed so that content specialists, educators, and scholars are determining what students learn and not elected officials with no expertise in the area. Well, it's the state legislator gives the State Board of Education its power, so it can be changed through state laws. So it's something that can be changed through the political process.
At what age, at what grade level is this material introduced?
It is integrated all the way down to kindergarten. Now, as you might imagine, in kindergarten, there's not much. So certainly as you go up, it gets more, but this is scattered in at all of the grade levels. I went through the TEKS for every grade, and you find this sort of thing all the way through.
One of the things that bothers me the most about this, and you danced around it a little bit, you kind of talked about it, is the way they have co-opted the word Christian.
Oh, yes.
Because they say they're Christians, but yet they differ from all of the mainstream religions except possibly the Seventh-day Adventists and the Pentecostals. And that is, they to a man and woman believe that the universe is 6,000 years old. So just like they cherry pick their history characters as to what they say, they cherry pick their biblical content as well. They believe the universe is 6,000 years old to a man and to a woman, so that's why when I'm referring to these people, you try to use quote Christians or quote real Americans. I just say the 6,000 year old universe people, and that covers it. But one of the, some of the biblical things that they completely avoid, and there are several scriptural things in the Bible that say that the earth is the center of the universe, and that the sun and the planets and everything go around the earth, and they leave that out. Right. And that and there's several scriptures that point out the earth is flat, and they leave those out.
Right. It's very selective, and I'd like to emphasize your point. I mean, these are people who are co-opting the term Christian and defining it to mean only people who happen to have their beliefs. And there are many conservative Protestants who do not share their agenda, that are not on their ideological wavelength. Certainly Catholics, mainline Protestants. So Christianity is diverse, and I tried to make that point early on. They're broader than just the 6,000-year-old Earth people. So it is a broader movement than that. But I couldn't agree with you more that the method they use is, well, you know, I grew up Protestant in the Deep South. We proof text. You turn to the Bible, you find the verse to support your agenda, and you quote it. That's what they do with the Bible, and that's what they do with the Founding Fathers. I mean, they are often misrepresenting the Founding Fathers themselves by presenting quotes out of context, or sometimes inventing quotes.
Right. So I think it is worth noting.
It's fundamentally anti-science, is what I'm saying.
Well, I think that's true. But there are many of them who believe you have to account for longer periods of time. That a day might be an age, and that sort of thing.
Not the Seventh-day Adventists, 6,000-year-old universe.
Well, I know there are many who do believe that, who believe that dinosaurs walked the earth at the same time as humans, and apparently the Flintstones was a documentary. But it is fair to say that a great many do allow for a greater period of time. Still, it is. It's just you've stretched it rather than looked at it in a different way.
Yes, just a quick actual question. Do you know the name of the Supreme Court decision from 1963 that you mentioned?
Sure. It's Abington v. Shemp. So, and there's one the year before that was on school prayer. And that's when everything started going downhill. Up until that time, there were no teen pregnancies and no STDs. And after that time, everything has just gone to hell in a handbasket.
So, and the Abington v. Shemp was the one that Madeline Murray O'Hare tried to take credit for, and actually she just sort of stepped onto it to get some of the credit. You know, she really didn't play that key role in that decision.
Is your talk published anywhere? Is it possible to find a written version of this?
Oh, well, Dr. Martin has graciously suggested I could put it up on the website, so I'll do that. And I've certainly, my Bible course studies can be found at tfn.org for Texas Freedom Network. If you follow the links over through Religious Freedom, then you can get to the 2 Bible course studies, tfn.org. This is the first time I've spoken on the social studies standards, so that's not anywhere, but I'll see if I can put it up on the website. Thank you. And thank you for asking.
Ryan Valentine has told us we can also put those 2 studies on the Baker Institute website, and that will be done soon. But I do recommend that you go to the TFN website. There'll be much more there than we'll have.
there's a lot of detail in those Bible course studies because we really wanted to put information out there so that people could read it and decide for themselves whether it was appropriate. So thank you for asking about that. I know.
Yes, in the debates that were ongoing about particularly the world history teaks, did anybody express any concern about increasing intolerance as an end product of children reared with these teak standards in place?
Lots of people raised concerns in the public comment, in the media, in statements to the board repeatedly. And and some of the board members are very reasonable. I don't want to say the whole board was like this, but there are board members who think that America was founded to be a particular type of religious nation and that everybody else is wrong and that Islam is other and the enemy. And so from their perspective, they're not promoting misinformation, they're just teaching children the truth.
Yeah, no, I just see it as rather alarming, especially in light of the recent report issued by the Southern Poverty Law Center about the increase in hate crimes. And it seems to me that in some form or fashion, these new teaks could inadvertently be complicit in contributing to some of those ideologies that lead to those crimes.
I completely agree. I think they will lead to that and to intolerance. I mean, here's an opportunity to nurture religious tolerance through educating children to respect differences of opinion, through the sympathetic study of different world traditions. And when the teaks talk about the world traditions, it's not that they are always heavy-handed in their treatment of other ones, although they sometimes are with Islam. It's just what they choose to study and what they leave out, that determines the emphasis. And so you see a lot about Islamic fundamentalism and Islamic terrorism. You don't get any diversification of any tradition other than Christianity. I mean, at least in Christianity, you have Protestants, Catholics, and Eastern Orthodox. But all the other traditions, they're all the same. So.
These people making these laws generally are thought not to be very tolerant toward gay and lesbian people. Is there anything in the social studies curricula about homosexuality, one way or the other?
Not so much in the social studies thing because, for most of American history, there were no gays, apparently, and so that is certainly a voice that's completely excluded from the history teaks. Now, you can find issues of sexuality over in the health education teaks, and that would be the place to go for that. And that's coming up in 2 years with the revision of those teaks. And although I have not looked at those, my guess is that it's not cutting-edge medical science. So, yes, ma'am.
As a scholar of religious history, I'm thinking back to the Scopes trial and the views do you think that this is really there's more of a religious focus on just fundamental Christianity now than there was then, say as a proportion, or it seems all so extreme, but then you look, go back to Scopes and it's all there.
It's always been with us, and we live in a time of tremendous social change. I mean, this is really a revolutionary period in history, and it's being accompanied by an increase in fundamentalism in multiple traditions around the world. And so what we're seeing is part of a larger phenomenon that's affecting each of the traditions in different ways.
Do you think it's more pervasive in the United States now than it was in the early 1900s?
I am so not the right person to ask that, because although Bill Martin is, so I'm going to let you address that. That's more up your alley than mine.
All right. At the time of the Scopes trial, there were more people who had believed those things all along, and they were being challenged. At the present, there is, and fundamentalism generally, as Mark has said, fundamentalism is in many respects a reaction, a reaction to the fear that everything not nailed down is coming loose. And I think that Islamic fundamentalism has risen in response to the problems that Islam was part of the Ottoman Empire, the empires before. It was the great empires of the world, and they had become that because God had given them that victory, and now they had lost that, and so something had gone wrong. If you leave the true Islam, this is going to go wrong. It's gone wrong. We've left the true Islam. We must go back. So they glom on to this strong form of fundamentalism that's happened in Christianity as well. So there was more in the time of the Scopes. I think there was more a fear that we are going to lose this. Now there's a fear we have lost this and we've got to get it back, or it's really going to be bad. So there is and also now you have the media, the specialized media, the segmented media, so that people can hear these messages over and over and over, and people meeting together in churches where a unified message is preached to people, all of whom believe it, over and over and over. Tonight here, this is probably not a random sample of Americans, and we tend there's probably a greater unanimity here than you might find in some places, but that I don't think fundamentalism reacts to ambiguity and to pluralism, which is to say to modernity, and I think it unlikely those are going to go away. So I don't see fundamentalism going away, but it is important to keep trying to let people know that pluralism is with us forever. And as I've tried to tell my students for many, many years, at least once a semester, one of the most efficacious arrows you can have in your intellectual and emotional quiver is a high tolerance for ambiguity. We must learn to sit loose to the saddle of certainty, because that is the modern condition. And I think that fundamentalists find it very difficult to deal with that particular phenomenon.
Thank you.
I didn't hear you mention the term American exceptionalism. Has that occurred in this study as well?
It's hyper-exceptionalism, and so it's to some extent it's just the current development of that older view, right? So it's American exceptionalism on steroids. Yeah, I mean, so that students aren't just taught this is an important idea in American history that's guided us and that's been so influential. That, of course, would be perfectly reasonable to talk about. But, those who have held American exceptionalism were right, because God did found us for God's purposes, and we are God's new people. It's not that explicit, but that's the idea that is driving it. And we're going to see that in the next presidential campaign. I read an article today about which of the presidential contenders were going to be able to ride the wave of American exceptionalism the best, and how Obama would respond to his Republican competitors in that regard.
Well, it's sort of worth stressing the enormous impact that this issue has had on the teaching of science and the ability of science, because we know that in teaching biology courses, for example, it's been impacted both by the reduction of the people that are willing to attend them in some parts of the country and in the way in which they're taught. And once you recognize and understand that modern science, many areas of modern science are tied to evolution, and then you say that they're wrong, that the scientists are wrong about all of this, then you cast a question about any other scientific conclusion, be it climate change or warming of the ocean or just many topics. It makes it very easy to criticize scientists, because we know that they're biased and prejudiced and they don't have good results. I think that's an important side part of all this.
It permeates the curriculum well into the science standards, into the health education standards, into the literature standards with what's read, but certainly in the science standards. When that battle happened a couple of years ago, suddenly now students will learn about supposed transitional forms in the fossil record. I mean, that's in the TEKS, those types of wording. So it casts doubt on things that scientists don't have doubts about. So I agree. This is a serious problem that can only be changed through the political process.
Do you know of any political or just pushback from parents who are not Christians, who, if I was a Muslim mother and had a child in school who had one of these textbooks, they expressed concern? Has there been any kind of movement or groups getting together or any kind of discussion? I'm not aware of any.
The ones that, I mean, certainly you have people making statements, writing columns, etc. The more visible pushback is on ethnic grounds. So LULAC has pushed back for the way Latino history is treated. The NAACP, both of those groups have filed complaints with the Federal Department of Education. The Mexican American Legislative Caucus is strongly pressuring the board to revise the TEKS. What religious groups do is a little more under the radar. It's harder to follow. I stumbled into Texas Freedom Network by accident because of the Bible course thing in Odessa, and I found them to be kind of the best conduit for news about who's pushing back on these sorts of issues. Certainly, Muslim groups are not happy about this. They're very aware. They're protesting. It's not particularly effective. Yes, sir.
Religiosity seems to be ascendant in the U.S. and the Middle East. How's the rest of the world faring?
Oh, well, you know, supposedly religion was going to die in the modern era, and that was the great secularization thesis, and it's turned out to be absolutely, completely wrong in every way. I mean, religion is burgeoning. It is the more conservative forms that are burgeoning. It's coming up particularly in the Southern Hemisphere, and if anything, the future ahead of us, people are going to be more religious sociologically than I think they have been in the past, particularly in an era of globalization. So yes, it is all around us. It's not going anywhere.
So Europe is not diminishing there, getting more?
Europe is so behind us, as the people who don't like France would say. France is so yesterday. It's the global South. It's the developing world that is burgeoning. It's where Christianity is growing. It's where Islam is multiplying. So it's Africa, it's Latin America, it's parts of Asia. I mean, that's where we're really seeing this growth. And through globalization, of course, there's much more connection between American communities and those communities in diverse global areas. And so now there's this interconnection that we never had before to the same degree.
So we're moving to a fantasy world.
No, we're moving to a world where people have diverse religiosity, which is why we need to figure out how we can talk amongst ourselves without killing each other. And that comes through a religious literacy program that helps us to sympathetically understand the other without having to agree with the other. That's not the mindset that's propelling these sorts of revisions.
I think we're also seeing that people are turning to religion when government and society has not served them well. They're looking for another way to be not superfluous, expendable. Example, in the United States, 40% of our population owns 2.5% of the wealth. And when you have that, you have a lot of people looking for something to get them through, something to help them, save them, and they turn to religion.
Make them feel better about themselves.
So we may have to look at a place outside religion, outside government, to give people the hope that they're turning to when they're turning to this kind of religion.
What did you have in mind?
Progressive taxation.
My wife just said economic parity.
At the at the Museum of Natural Science, I am seeing a lot of variety of religions bringing their children to the museum to study science, and I'm hearing some numbers bounce around, like 20% of Texas children are homeschooled, and a lot of the homeschoolers are coming to the museum to get their dose of science.
It's interesting. I mean, there's a scholar at Rutgers named Catherine Lugg who talks about the Christian right and public education. And her argument is that the Christian right has employed two strategies. One is to re-Christianize public education, and that's what I've talked about tonight. But the other is to de-Christianize public education by pulling out and multiplying private schools and fostering homeschooling. And so particularly amongst those groups, I mean, a lot of different people homeschool for a lot of different reasons. But there are certainly some groups that are reacting against public education so that they can make sure that they have control over what their children learn. And it's religiously motivated. And that's fine, except when we have, in the cases where it produces citizens who don't necessarily understand mainstream science. And then it becomes a civic issue. So I'm torn between understanding that, in our society, we value parental control and autonomy over our children's upbringing, but I also have an eye towards the future and the civic needs we're going to need in a complex society.
Just a quick question. I think you had said that the standards-based education was vulnerable to being co-opted. Could you elaborate just a bit on what you meant by that?
Sure. When you have a group like the Texas State Board of Education who can go through and say students will learn this and this and this and this and this, when you're getting that specific, then whatever group is doing that determining has a lot of power to shape all of education. If there's more flexibility, it's not as subject to co-opting. And they're very aware of this. I mean, Don McElroy and the St. Louis Tea Party meeting said, in standards-based education, somebody's values are going to be taught. It's just a question of whose values. And McElroy continued. And that's why we're so lucky that conservative Christians have dominated the Texas State Board of Education, because now we've infused the standards with our theological values. I mean, he said that very explicitly. And so it is a strategy. And he's right. If somebody's values are going to be taught, my personal preference would be values that had greater appreciation for pluralism.
It is worth noting that he was defeated.
That's true. That's true.
Gail Lowe was not, and she's currently in charge, and she's exactly the same.
Yeah, that's true. They pick them one at a time.
Yeah. He's still on the board, though, isn't he?
No, he was defeated.
He's off right now.
Yeah, he's off.
He's off. I know he was defeated, but I didn't know. Yeah, he's gone.
He has fingers on the board,
Well, he influences Gail Lowe, who's the current 6,000-year-old universe school board chair.
All right. Well,
thank you so much. I've really appreciated your joining me tonight. Thank you for such a gracious reception.